Hello there. Welcome to Anthropology 390. Our first presentation together, well, kind of together. This is Mediterranean archaeology. I don't have to say anything like if you're in the wrong class, leave the room because, well, yeah, because we're all connected here virtually by Canvas, and everyone here is supposed to be here. My name, Jeanette Cooper, Dr. Jeanette Cooper. There's a picture of me taken in my friend Tony's garden. I am a classical archaeologist. That's kind of a complicated term. Such a complicated term that we spend basically the whole of this first week on that topic. I think that you will see in the way that I've developed this course, the kind of variety of readings I've given you and videos and so forth, that you're going to find a combination of approaches to this subject matter. All professional archaeologists, have some sort of theoretical approach to the work they do. I'd say it's stronger in some than others. My theoretical approach to my work has been via post-colonial theory. So I think that you will sort of find that bent to some of the things I say or some of my interpretations as we go throughout the course. In fact, I have one reading on it, early in the course so that you'll sort of understand that take on the subject. More about me. I like to introduce myself to the first day of class, just people know who they're talking to, who their teacher is, and so forth. It's a nice way for us all to get to know each other, although I don't get to know you very well this way, do I? But I think it's especially important in this class, because in this class I have the absolute honor to talk about something that has driven me passionately for decades. And so that passion, I think, needs to kind of be introduced to you. In my undergraduate experiences, I first, started to pursue history. I was really interested in the past and how we came to be where we are and what trials we encountered along the way, what made us who we are and behave the way we do. And that last sentence especially might make you understand how, behave the way you do kind of led me towards anthropology. So here I have these, combination of interests, interest in the past and interest in the way people behave, tried to couple them together. My undergraduate institution, which, by the way, was Humboldt State University, did not have and still does not have any particular discipline in which, one can study the deep past of the Mediterranean world, which was the geographical space that was really most fascinating to me and most interesting to me, partly because a lot of the things I was learning about were saying, we are a product of Greek democracy, and we are the Greek world and so forth is a legacy, etc., yada yada yada. And I say yada 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 because I spent a lot of my graduate and professional career, basically breaking down these claims. To be perfectly honest, I spent a lot of time searching for those roots. And the deeper and the darker and the further in the past I searched for those roots, the more I had to find the answers myself. Actually be out there and engage in archaeology, making those interpretations firsthand, and sometimes reinterpreting the past. So that not only I could understand it better, but so that others could as well. So that's kind of where I'm coming from here, was this need to know and this fascination with the Mediterranean. And of course, that led me to lots of field work. Once I realized as an undergraduate, that I was going to be excavating the past, I immediately started making sure that I had the kind of excavation experience that would be necessary to see me flourish in my field. So at Humboldt State University, that meant doing lots and lots of field work in Northwest California. So I spent a couple of years doing masses of survey, doing cultural resource management work, doing excavations, both for archaeological firms and for Six Rivers National Forest. I did a couple with them. I got lots of first-hand experience. I learned a lot of my technical skills here in the Northwest Coast. When I went off to graduate school, I expanded and started, working in other parts of the world. I did first-hand work. I did, on an excavation team in Turkey. That was my first encounter with Turkey, which is a truly spectacular place that has been dear to my heart ever since. I did not actually go to Crete, but I processed all the original survey data that was taken from a portion of the island of Crete. You can see here on the slide here where I talk about my master's thesis. So that was my master's project, and I basically tried to assert a method for interpreting social hierarchy through burial evidence from this particular part of Crete, Gornia, which is a place first excavated by Harriet Boyd Hawes, a century ago, and a surrounding smaller settlement called Swingaras. So that was pretty fascinating work, and that work is still pertinent, and I'm proud of it, and that it's still being presented and discussed, and has made its contribution to the study of the Minoan culture on ancient Crete. Minoans is something we'll be able to spend a very short period of time on when we get to our section on the Bronze Age. So, my graduate work didn't end there, and neither did my field work. Other places that I did field work were France. I worked with the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill team in France. That was pretty interesting. And I did field work in Britain, excavating a Roman fort and processing the ceramics from that excavation. And I did excavation for multiple years on the island of Sicily in the Mediterranean, which we'll talk about for the majority of our time today. The culmination of my work on the island of Sicily was my doctoral thesis, which I've listed here. Sorry, that is my telephone. So we're not going to answer it, but I hope it doesn't distract you. I've already said too much to start again, so bear with it. Okay, we're listening to it, but the machine will go on, and then it will stop. Okay?
Hello.
I'm right here. Do you hear that? The answering machine. I'm so sorry. Okay, that's done. So moving on. Thank you for your patience. So more about me. Yay! Me in the Mediterranean. What I want to do today really is actually share with you some of the work that I've done in the Mediterranean, on the island of Sicily, the site in which I worked to complete my dissertation. And one of the, there's a multitude of reasons why I want to do that, partly because I think it's important. and partly because it's of interest to me. So I'm hoping to sort of perhaps have you feel some of the passion I do and being interested in these things. But also I'm going to be using, quite honestly, a lot of terminology that perhaps some of you have had in other courses, like Introduction to Archaeology, or other regional studies, like perhaps Central American archaeological studies. But some of you, don't have as much background. And quite honestly, even in these other courses, we may not have used all the terminology that we're going to use here. So being able to talk about this one site, I think, gives us a way of getting practice using the words and on topics that we're going to be looking at repeatedly throughout the course. So the site that we're going to focus on today is called Monte Polizzo. Monte is basically Italian for mountain. Whoops, and that was just kind of just a little teaser there. All right, going back here. So where's Monte Polizzo? Monte Polizzo, as I said before, is in the island of Sicily. Can you find it in the picture? I'm guessing yes. It's the big red blotch in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's actually, Monte Polizzo is an interesting site in part because it's on that island, and because of what I just said, it's in the middle of the sea. Islands, some people view islands as sort of crossroads with respect to maritime traffic, places where cultures connect, stopping places on longer roads. And Sicily, being smack in the middle of the Mediterranean, marks it potentially as just that kind of place. And to be perfectly honest, I think in many ways it has been that kind of place. And we'll look at some of those international connections when we look at this site. Also, I want to just, while we're here looking at this picture, kind of just look at the whole a bit more and just talk about where we are. I like this picture for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it's got no words on it. And because I think sometimes words can be a bit jumbly and distracting. So you're just kind of here while you're listening to me, looking at these landforms and going to hopefully give you one of your first careful tours of the region. I also like it because it's got the modern national boundaries eked out, which is I think sort of helpful too when you're getting oriented. In week 2, we're going to do getting over a cold here. In week 2, we're going to do a map, a cartography exercise, and in which I'm going to ask you to plot a whole range of places and spaces. Again, trying to help you to get a firmer ground on this particular area. So here we go. Anyway, so the big blue space, right? You know what that is, right? Tell me you know that's the Mediterranean. Okay, you do. I know. Of course you do. What you probably don't know is that the Mediterranean Sea is in part a collection of subsidiary seas. So there's these smaller areas. So, for example, this area here, I presume you can see my cursor. I sure hope so. Because I've actually never done one of these before, so here's hoping. So my cursor, this area right here, is called the Aegean Sea. And we'll refer to that over and over again. This area right here is called the Adriatic Sea, right? This area here is called the Ionian Sea. And right here is the Tyrrhenian Sea. And then we have the Balearic Sea. So it's got all these other little, then there's the Sea of Crete, by the way, over here, these little subsidiary seas. And it's also got a lot of islands. All these islands have a name. And I don't necessarily need you to know every single tiny island within the Cycladic Islands, by the way. That's what these are, Cycladic Islands. But there's going to be a couple, for example, Cycladic Islands that are going to play a big role at some point in time. So I will ask you to know them. I certainly want you to know big ones, right? So this is Cyprus here. Pretty interesting place. Played a lot of played active role in dynamics in the East and Egypt. A great source for copper. Yeah, that's right. I'm really interested in trade, so I'm going to be particularly interested in where key resources come. Copper. Yeah. This is the island of Crete. Right. Super interesting place, especially when we're in the Bronze Age. This is the Peloponnese in Greece here. This is not an island. This is a peninsula, right? Because it sticks out, and it's shaped like a boot, so you know what it is, right? It's Italy. But off of Italy is our place here we're going to spend our time about today. But then we've got Sardinia here and Corsica, and I've already mentioned Balearic Sea. But then, of course, these are the Balearic Islands. There's a couple of other tiny islands in here that are of interest too. Pantelleria is interesting because it's a sort of a western source of obsidian. Whereas a more eastern source of obsidian is going to be the island of Milos. Whereas Naxos, which is another island in here, is going to be an important source for emery, which is great for basically sanding down soft rock like marble that's found on various places. But, some of the best they say is on the little island of Paros. We don't spend much time worrying about Paros, but there's a little island named Malta over here. And Malta we're going to take a super brief look at that when we're looking at the prehistory section. So I'm sorry to go on and on and on because we're not really there yet, but I just thought it was a good time to take this opportunity to see where we are. Spain, France, Italy, right? Here's the Straits of Gibraltar. This big blue mass over here, right, is actually the Black Sea. All right, I'm going to go on now. Thanks for your patience. So I'm going to talk about the island of Sicily, give you sort of a general tour of the island itself so you can kind of see the landscape better when I'm taking this kind of tour, but also kind of looking at, just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to cultural, archaeological remains. This island has remains from much earlier periods than I'm going to deal with in the rest of this lecture today. But just to give you a taste, one of the very special places on the island is one of the older places that dates from the Bronze Age. It's in located in this southeastern section of the island, not far from Syracuse, which is down there. And Pantalica, this is kind of a map. It shows all these different ways through this mountain range here, and along the sides, of these mountains throughout are these extraordinary rock-cut tombs used for burials. It's really an extraordinary place. It's awe-inspiring. It is overwhelming. In terms of this, the awesome presence of these mountainsides filled with tombs. My pictures don't even do it justice. And what's extraordinary is too, so you can drive through the valley itself, but there's these trails you can take, which I highly recommend. And that's my behind, by the way. So, sorry, it's maybe rude, but there I am, yes, looking in tombs. But you get at the bottom of the trails, and there's this extraordinary river at the bottom that you expect nymphs to pop out of the caves and water at any moment. Just really a magical place, and it would not be hard to imagine certain magical qualities being ascribed to this. this whole valley as well as the river at the bottom. But anyway, sorry, not going backwards, but going forwards. The period of time that I'm mostly going to be focusing on this particular lecture today is termed in my discipline as the Greek Archaic period. This more or less just corresponds to the period between about the 8th, excuse me, not the 8th, maybe the end of the 9th, beginning in the 9th, but the 8th to 6th century BC. This is an incredibly dynamic period of time, especially in our, throughout the Mediterranean, but certainly in the island of Sicily as well. And I think this map really shows what's happening, because during this period of time, we have peoples. You can see here the blue are places that are being settled by Greek peoples. The purple are being settled by Phoenician peoples, but yet all of these peoples have landed on this island that is not uninhabited. We know certainly from our earliest documentation that from a Greek historian by the name of Thucydides, who says that there were three groups on the island that considered themselves, different from one another, and considered that they had different origins from each other. Again, the Greeks and Phoenicians descended upon an island that was already inhabited. And they had two very different ways of doing that, too, which is kind of interesting, and we won't get into too much talk today. Certainly when we get a little bit later, we're going to talk about Iron Age peoples in a few weeks, and we'll be able to touch a little bit more on these peoples called Phoenicians, and potentially talk about their methodology with respect to expansion in the Mediterranean. And that differs very much from the Greeks' methodology. In short, the Greeks were looking for new homes, new places to start new cities. They were plagued by overpopulation and political factionism, in which the losers of political arguments were basically ousted out of Greece and expected to find some new homes someplace. Phoenicians, however, had been since at least the previous century trading with all sorts of people throughout the Mediterranean. They were great maritime traders. And their focus in setting up spaces in foreign lands was basically to set up sort of trade centers. They didn't expand into the interior. We don't have a lot of evidence for them having large populations or anything like that. They seem to be focusing as on little places where they could contact and exchange things with indigenous populations. Okay, moving on. So there's as you saw from that map in the previous slide, there's a series of places that were settled by foreign peoples. I'm going to just give you the super superficial tour of some of those places. Just to tell you that the location of the site that I'm going to be focusing on later is actually right here in the very western part of the island. It's probably partly between the words Segesta and the word Alymian. So you can see that this particular site that we're looking at this slide, the ancient site of Selinunte, the site of Selinunte or ancient Salinas, is located just to the south of the site that I pointed out, between Segesta and the Alymians. Now, I point this out especially because Salinas will be the closest Greek settlement to Monte Polizzo, which is the site, again, that I'm focusing on today. But Monte Polizzo was an indigenous site. It's a settlement of Alymians. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested at Monte Polizzo, and was interested at, is how the Alymians dealt with all these foreign peoples descending upon them. And so it's, with that question in mind, it's especially important to notice where those nearest Greek foreign peoples are. So, Salinas, yeah, this is a full-on colony, Greek colony, with multiple gigantic temples. These are just remains of some of them. This is a really large and important Greek city, founded by people that originally came from the area of Corinth in Greece. Just monumental, right? I mean, check out this. Extraordinary, huh? Segesta. Now, I said Segesta before because I pointed it out because it was on the western part of the island there, and talking that the site I was dealing with, Monte Polizzo, right, was between that and where the word Elimians is on our map here on the left. So another reason why we really want to point this site out. Now, Segesta is kind of a funny anomaly, in that we feel certain, both from excavation and from ancient texts, that Segesta was an indigenous site. But your eyes can tell you what I don't need to tell you vocally, that indigenous site exhibited certain elements of Greek culture. This is a Greek-style theater, as you can see, with an extraordinary view, by the way. And here's someone sitting on one of the steps of the theater. And here is a play being performed. Yes, plays are still performed at this theater. Do bring your cushion, because those stones are not comfortable to sit on for any length of time whatsoever. Darn right cold and painful after an hour or so. I imagine what the Greeks would have done. I wonder if they had cushions that they brought along as well. They also have this temple. You can see it in the distance here in the landscape, which I think is kind of extraordinary perspective. But here's some views of the temple itself. The interesting about this temple is while at first glance it really it appears absolutely and totally Greek. One of the things that has interested scholars is the fact that there are a few characteristics of this temple that are not found in any other temple anywhere in the Greek world. So Greek, they had sort of a formula. In fact, it was culturally determined in part. The Ionic Greeks, which are Greeks that are living in the eastern part, and we'll go back to all these things another time. So don't feel like you have to memorize everything I have to say today. I'm really just trying to introduce you to the whole world here. The whole Mediterranean world. So the Ionic Greeks are living in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, more or less the western coast of Turkey. And then one way of building a temple. The people, the Doric Greeks had another way of building a temple. So there are certain formulae, is the point. But what's interesting is that the Elimians, apparently living here, who decided that it would be a good idea to have these things built, also decided that they didn't need to do it exactly the way the Greeks did, which is kind of interesting. We're still trying to solve some of these curiosities and to understand why and why they did it and why they did it in the way they did. So enough for Segesta. Erice, or ancient Eryx, basically, this was probably a Phoenician site, which is interesting because it's named after a minor Greek god, but it's on this high promontory, which is interesting. Perhaps not really typical of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians tended to have the settlements certainly by safe harbors on promontories or islands just off the coast of the mainland, so that they wouldn't actually be sort of mixing with. They would only be on the periphery of indigenous populations. But it also had a medieval component, as exhibited here by these cobbled streets and all these stone structures. These I've shown you just two temple areas. There's lots of temples up in Agrigento, which is ancient Acragas. This is also listed here. There we go, Acragas, right? Not terribly far, but too far to really enact directly with the peoples that we have at Monte Polizzo. Syracuse, this is, whoops, I didn't give a map here, but Syracuse is really on the far southeast corner of the island. I'd mentioned it once before when we were looking at Pantalica, because it's not too far from Pantalica, but this was another really big Greek center. They too have a theater. Amongst, and various temples throughout the area. I also want to note that a lot of these places, while they started out perhaps as Greek colonies or indigenous colonies or even Phoenician colonies, would much later have a Roman component. So Roman culture would have moved in, much later, and basically, in many ways, sort of built right on top of the cities that were already there. Himera, another a Greek settlement with a gigantic temple of Zeus that built right by a railroad track. This is all that's really left of it. Mozia, or ancient Motia, is the closest Phoenician settlement to the Elymian settlement of Monte Polizzo. So it's also, pretty important when we're thinking about international connections and contacts with outsiders from the site that I'm going to be talking about today, Monte Polizzo, right? So I said that Salinas, right, is going to be super important because that's the nearest Greek one. But Mocha is super important because it's the nearest and most prominent Phoenician one. So here's a couple of pictures of them. Here's salt flats. Here, building foundations. The aerial is quite good because I had mentioned before that the Phoenician modus operandi, right, was to have settlements just with good harbors, and often in little islands off the coast. And here, that's exactly what they've done, the little island off the coast of the island. Back here you see the actual island of Sicily, and yet this is where Motia is. Oh, one more thing. This is kind of an interesting place that we find in Phoenician settlements. It's called a Tophet. And Tophet is a sacred space, or sacred precinct, somebody you could say. The Phoenicians often got a bad name, saying that they were crazy, murderous child killers. Truth is they probably did, like actually many cultures of the Near East. You might remember even biblical Abraham, in times of community stress. Yes, child sacrifice was practiced. But these graveyards don't. What we've realized through intensive studies, these little sacred precinct or necropolies don't just represent sacrificed children. In fact, there's very little evidence of sacrificing them. What they do seem to represent, though, are either stillbirths, children who died prior to birth or shortly after birth, or even children up to a young age, up to I think it's 3 years old, that died prematurely. So they may remember many cultures, and we're not 100% sure in Phoenician, but many have ritual, especially where there's high infant mortalities. Will have a ritual in which a child is accepted by its community once it reaches that age where it's more likely to actually survive. And we think that's what's going on here, is that children that are born prior to that point in which they say, now you're a part of our community, may well have been needed to go into this separate sacred precinct so that they were somehow separated from the necropolis of community members for whatever reason. And just to reassert again that throughout the island, once we get to the certainly the time of the Punic Wars, I know I'm probably inundating with information here, but again, I want to just state I'm just trying to get your feet wet today and give you a feel for the dynamics that are happening in the Mediterranean. And it's these dynamics that we see evidence of when we are excavating. And that's, so there's a lot for people, archaeologists who work in the Mediterranean. There's a lot of history and prehistory to understand in order to discern what's going on in these contexts. Huge spaces of time and movements of people, and it's extraordinary. Anyway, so I just thought I'd throw in one slide here of a famous and popular Roman period site on the island, Piazza Armerina. And it's a Roman villa with all kinds of extraordinary mosaics on the floors. These are floors, and it's just beautiful. Including this is one of the most famous ones right here. I think that somebody has flippantly called it bikini bathers or something. But the truth is, there was no such thing as a Roman bikini. And quite honestly, the iconography in that particular mosaic is really unique and distinct throughout the whole Roman world. It's not like we're like, oh, we have one of those over at Pompeii. No, not at all, not at all. So it's really unique, and it appears to be women engaging in athletic training. So it's kind of cool. It's been studied a lot, but it still holds a lot of mysteries for us. There is your island tour. Hope you enjoyed it. Because now we're going to come back to that one part of the island that I keep sort of referring to. And we're going to get into it, understanding, hopefully, or at least having had an introduction to the dynamics on the island and what's going on in other parts of the island. So back to this place, right, that I said was just sort of south of the site of Segesta, Monte Polizzo. There it is. There's the Monte itself. Yay! The mountain. And the settlement we're going to look at is primarily on the top, but not just on the top, but all along this top portion of the mountain. And I'll show you a little map in a moment. The site the site was first discovered about 1970 when the forestali, I'm just looking to translate forestali. Forest Service doesn't even quite do it, but let's go there. Let's call them Forest Service people. Basically, they were going in and building a fire break. So, which is, in many ways, it kind of just looks like a big wide dirt road. It's a place in which, should there be a fire, that the fire would have a hard time jumping across that big vacant space with no vegetation. And it's a way to control fires, which is probably obvious to both of you. So forgive me for telling you the obvious. Anyway, so when they were cutting through to create this, they encountered this. So basically, having cut through this wall here, what they exposed was, a gigantic pit. Big, giant landfill sort of thing. Garbage pit, but ancient landfill. So you can see all the little specks along here. All these little specks, some of them are rocks, right? You can see this kind of line-ish of rocks, right? But then some of it is bone. In fact, there was a lot of bone, and a lot of pottery, and a few other bits and bobs that were of interest as well. So in 1960, they kind of reported it. It's like, oh, to the the supervisor, of archaeology in Sicily. So the government knew it was there, and they just let it be. 1998, 1999, so it was nearly 30 years later, a Scandinavian team actually came to excavate this particular area. They basically did some sample excavations along the profile wall. They did some experimental methodology, which I've got to tell you turned out to be not a successful experiment. We won't get through that. But fortunately, they only did a little portion of it. They didn't mess it all up. To be perfectly honest, it's such a huge space. It would take, decades and a fortune to excavate the entire sort of ancient garbage landfill area. They named it at this time the profile, and ever since then, we've always called anyone that is associated the site has called this place the profile. The reason it's called the profile is in a way, if you're doing an archaeological excavation, and I'll show you examples of this in just a moment. One of the things that you do is after you expose an area, let's say you had dug down in this area. One of the things you would do is you would draw its profile, right? Showing the various layers, stratigraphic layers. You see how we go from light here to darker. Then we go to a slightly different colored soil with lots of rocks here. And then we go to a slightly different colored soil. And then we go to right? So we basically draw it all out. And so this is called a profile. So in a way, the land is showing this exposing its profile to us. So during the field season of 2000, an American team joined excavations at Monte Polizzo. And by this time, the Scandinavian team is still working, but they're working in a completely different part of the site, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. And there's an Italian team working in a very, very small Italian team doing a very small part of the site. And then there's this really gigantic American team led by Dr. Ian Morris of Stanford University. And they excavate Monte Polizzo from 2000 to 2007. I joined this excavation in 2001 and then went through 2007. So here's the map I promised you. You're like, oh, that's better. No. Imagine you are the crow, right? So you're the crow, and here we are looking at an aerial view. Now, let's go back to where that profile wall was. See here, profile. Do you remember I talked about that fire break, right? How that big, wide sort of dirt road they would have dug to break the fire? Yeah, there it is here, right? And here's the one perpendicular one here. So that's where the profile is in that fire break. Further up the hill, at the top of the hill, the Acropolis, the high city, that's what it's basically a Greek word that means, the high city. This is the area that was excavated by the Stanford team. And they took over excavations at the profile. On the same note, the Scandinavians are predominantly working over in this area. And then there's a little Italian group over here. Couple of pictures of the site, amazing views. And people digging up all kinds of things. Here we are a gigantic, there's one or several pithoi. This will be a word you'll probably see repeated throughout this course. Pithos in the singular, pithoi in the plural. Basically, a gigantic ceramic storage jar. These jars are often found predominantly buried, with only perhaps the top couple inches of the vessel itself protruding above the ground level. It's a way of storing foods and keeping them cool, especially during a Sicilian summer. That would be super important. Sorry. And so they come in big, thick, giant sherds, and we certainly saw a lot of those from Monte Polizzo, which is to be perfectly understood because it's a settlement and they're storing food. So here is a wall, and here are people boogieing down at break time, and nice view. And this is a woman named Trinity who's contemplating. Few more scenes, basically, showing excavated portions of the site. Working with the Stanford team, and this is us at the end of the day. The different seasons we tried to get up on the mountain in different ways. Some seasons we always had to drive a certain way to even get close to the mountain, and so the idea was to basically drive as close as you could, right? And so that your walk is not quite as far. Anyway, so back to the profile, right? You remember this? Remember this picture here? And this was the whole fire break. Okay, so here we are in the profile. So we dig into it. We just dig straight into this wall, right? Straight back. And so what we have is a series of 3 trenches or 3 sections while we're digging back into the profile here. And here's the picture of the excavated portion. We have these sort of scaffolding up because it's when you dig this deeply, basically it's a safety hazard. We didn't want any workers getting buried alive and so forth. And so why the profile? Well, the profile, because it was a profile, to be perfectly honest. I mean, because it appeared that things were put down into the dirt in a very systematic and chronological way, that it was a well-stratified deposit. That means that things were deposited in such a way as that they were not disturbed. So the things lowest to the ground were the oldest. The things just above it were a bit newer, and the things just above that were a bit newer, etc., etc., etc. And that's not always the case in archaeology. For 1,000 different reasons, things get a little bit mushed up or changed. So this seemed to be very well stratified and preserved. It also, we were able to tell that it represented probably about 150 years of activity, and indeed it did. And this was really tempting because this was double of any other comparable regional deposit. Anything else, certainly in Western Sicily, only covered about half of that. So really, wow, we were able to, in a way, put pieces together, answer some big questions in the region, chronologically what was happening. It also offered opportunities for establishing a fixed sequence of indigenous and colonial ceramics for Western Sicily. That's what I did. Western Sicily they were digging up things, but they really didn't understand the dates of what they were digging. In many ways, they needed this kind of stratified deposit to say which came before which and which came after which. This deposit and dating this deposit allowed other sites in the region to say, so this is older or this is newer, when they didn't have this beautiful sort of well-stratified area that we did. Um, it also offered an opportunity for recording the best stratified faunal sequence in Western Sicily, right? So again, 150 years of faunal deposits. And then finally, for studying and publishing the only botanical sequence, the only one in Western Sicily. So for that, we're very thankful to the Germans. In the last slide of our presentation today, I will just give you just a little snippet of what our German friends have found. So how did we go about doing this? Well, we did not use the experimental methods that I mentioned before by the Scandinavian team. We excavated the profile using, in fact, all of the Stanford excavations utilized stratigraphic levels. Stratigraphic levels or layers is the term we use when we're excavating according to the stratigraphy. I know it's kind of a circular definition. Forgive me. Allow me to continue. Basically, when soils and other things are deposited over time, it happens in episodes that can be discerned in the soil as changes in color, texture, and inclusions. So, if you're keeping an eye out for changes and stop excavating when you see those changes happening, you can isolate the finds within layers and basically be secure about what is happening before and after other things. This picture here is a drawing of all the levels, the places where excavators dug, but yet found that things changed radically. And so they stopped and they said everything, they measured and they said everything from beyond here is different. And then they stopped again and said everything beyond here is different, etc., etc. Other places, or alternately, excavations at other sites sometimes use regular intervals of extraction. Basically, they measure arbitrary levels is the term is often used. They measure certain levels. So basically, then they're more interested in understanding all the artifacts that are found within a space of 30 centimeters. Now, if you look at this here, right, if I had dug down just in 30 centimeter intervals, I would have probably included, especially if I'm down here, in numerous levels in which I would have labeled them as coming from the same context when actually they did not. Those 30 centimeter arbitrary levels allow like CRM excavators to do things quickly because they're really usually up against time and allows them to make some sense, but it's a lot slower to dig by stratigraphic levels. Anyway, sorry, going on, not backwards. Here's the profile. The profile, there's the picture I just showed you, and here's the other side of the deposit to see that they're not, in some ways, they're not too dissimilar, but in other ways, in the middle of that excavation unit, things stopped and started. For example, do you see this big rocky layer on this side? Not really. So someplace in the middle, between this side and this side, those rocks stopped. It's the director's job at the end of an excavation to make sense of all this. The excavator looks and says things change. They try to note things carefully so that they can be, put into environmental contexts, chronological contexts, and then it's up to the directors to make sense of the big picture. And once, and we're certainly going to do this right now, and you won't be having to do anything like that in this class, so don't worry. But I just want you to understand you may also get references to Harris matrix levels and in some of your readings. And I want you to know what those are, and that those are basically an intensive study of the excavation records and profiles and finds to try and make sense of what is happening at what point in time. And in the end, what the director will have done will be to have combined various of these levels here into big phases. And throughout these 5 phases, you have a chronological sequence of materials. And that goes back as to perhaps just before the middle of the 7th century BC. So, whew, I know. Is that enough? No, it's not enough. Okay, just relax. If you need a pause, just breathe. I'm going to have a drink of tea here, yep. And because now I realize that what I've got to do, I've just told you that Harris matrix, went from modern, we had this topsoil amount, right, that just had like some current stuff going on. But beyond that topsoil, things date to the middle 6th century all the way back to probably the early 7th century. And so what is going on in the Mediterranean world during that time? I've given you an island tour and talked about things, but I kind of want to look at these periods of time here and put them a little bit in perspective. This was a really hard chart to make, I want to tell you, because I could have written, every single one of these centuries, volumes, right? I could write volumes. But I kind of want to let you know that things are happening around this site. So not in this profile area, but in other parts of the site, we see evidence that it was settled as early as the 8th century BC. And that's interesting because that's a period of time when we know both Phoenicians, right, like the people living at Monte, and Greeks, like the people living at Salinas, right, were moving westward from their homelands, usually engaged in trade, not necessarily having, although the Phoenicians are starting to have small sort of, trading settlements in certain places, but not on Sicily yet. In the 7th century, our settlement at Monte Polizzo grows. It expands both in population and in size, more structures there. And it's also the same time that we see the first evidence of activity in the area that I focus on, the profile, in that big dump. We see the first stuff coming down there in the 7th century. In the Western Mediterranean, what's happening is that Greeks and Phoenicians are both colonizing different areas on Sicily. Phoenicians focusing the west, western portion, the Greeks kind of doing everything else. We also have another group of people that we haven't talked about yet, and that we will only get to spend a moment or two of time on later in the semester, and that's the Etruscans. Now, the Etruscans are the people that dominated much of Italy, let us say, at least half or more of what we now consider Italy would have been dominated by a cultural group of people called the Etruscans. They were very much an agricultural people, but a maritime people as well. They're engaged in trade. So just to the north of Sicily here, the Etruscans are very active. The Etruscans are probably even setting up colonies in the next century in the southern coast of France. So we just, so that's what's happening in the West there. These are the people that are sailing around our island, our Greeks, Phoenicians, and Etruscans. By the 6th century, our site, Monte Polizzo, flourishes. It is population height. That is the period of greatest expansion. It's the period in which the both ceramics and other archaeological artifacts are greatest in number, and craftsmanship is at its finest. Western Mediterranean, this is a period when we start to see Greek colonies in Sicily expanding. Now, what I mean by this is, sure, those initial colonies that were set down are getting bigger and are needing more of the hinterland, of the landscape for farming and stuff. But there's more to it than that. There's a whole nother phase of colonization in which those initial colonies set up their own colonies. That's right, a whole, sort of like the grandchild of Greece, right? In other places. They're expanding their territory by starting whole new cities. And it's not just one, it's all of them. So they're really, going strong. It's a height of activity for both indigenous people here, it seems, at Monte Polizzo, and Greeks on the island. It's also a height of activity and wealth and flourishing, artistic flourishing in Italy as well. The Etruscans, my goodness, this is the time of princely tombs and beautiful bronze items. So, something's going on in the Western Mediterranean in general. I mean, perhaps it's partly climate connected, because everywhere people are trading and flourishing, and wealth is everywhere. At that same period of time, Rome becomes a republic. Rome had started out as just one of the many settlements in an area next to the Etruscans in Italy called Latium, and they were just one city, and they had been growing certainly for 100 years at least. When I say it becomes a republic, prior to that moment, it had supposedly been run by Etruscan kings, even though the Roman people were not Etruscan. But Etruscan kings had been ruling them. So at one point in the 6th century, the stories say that the Romans kicked out the Etruscan kings and started to rule themselves as a republic. 5th century, Monte Polizzo is abandoned. Not a clue as to why. Just abandoned. What else is happening in Western Sicily? Well, seems there's a lot of conflict. On the island of Sicily, there's conflict between Phoenicians and Greeks. Quite honestly, there's also, this is a period of time when not just the Phoenicians and Greeks on the island are in conflict, but it also appears that people from outside are getting involved. So we see the Greeks from the mainland coming over, but that's kind of disastrous, by the way. But we also see that one of the Phoenicians' largest and most successful colony in all of the Mediterranean at Carthage, that the people from there actually start to get involved in what's going on in Sicily. So it seems to be a confrontational, tumultuous time in the Western Mediterranean at all. In fact, quite honestly, it's that way in the Eastern Mediterranean too, because it's in the 5th century that we have the Peloponnesian War. And you may not be familiar with that, but that's basically the war that started by a group of Greeks that were allied with Athens and a group of people that were allied with Sparta, and they clashed together to fight a sort of, well, you can't really call it a civil war because they were never one political group, but call it the Peloponnesian War. Anyway, and so by the 4th century, Monte Polizzo is reoccupied again, not certainly with the same numbers that it ever had before, and then in the same century, abandoned once again. So there was an attempt to get it going, but it didn't really happen. And then we see no activity at all on the mountain until the medieval period. In the 4th century, the conflicts between Phoenicians and Greeks. By this time, we're really not talking about Phoenicians. We're really talking about the peoples that had the descendants of those people that had colonized Carthage in northern Africa, modern Tunisia. So we're really talking about them hundreds of years after Phoenicians had colonized Carthage. So they're really a different group of people now that have evolved into their own sort of expansionist selves in a way. And we tend to call them Carthaginians as opposed to Phoenicians, but I'm trying to simplify things. Anyway, at the same time, we have Rome expanding. They're not just a republic now, they're expanding and conquering all of their neighbors in Italy. That's right. Rome has begun being its own expansionary self. This is soon going to be a world that is going to be dominated by the Romans. So, I talked before about the methodology used for excavation, and I showed you the profile pit and drawings of the profile. And once things are excavated, though, yes, the notes and the finds and the drawings and everything certainly need to get interpreted by the director, as I said before, and he draws up the Harris matrix and tries to make sense of it. But somebody needs to people need to process all those things that came out of the dirt. And so how we do that is of importance too. So this is what I mean by post-excavation methodology. So first, we try, here's a picture on top here of a group of hardy excavators after a long day in the hot sun. They've brought back their finds. There are debates these days about whether archaeologists should wash pottery when it comes out of the soil or not. I think that a lot of people see the value in both approaches. Certainly, if there's very little of it, I certainly probably would not wash it unless it was impossible to see what was under the dirt. But in Monte Polizzo, considering it was these sort of big dig that was happening here. Well, I mean, heck, we had like 130 people one year. I mean, just really huge. That was our biggest. And I'm talking about processing tens of thousands of potsherds. We wash them every day. Now, we did our best to instruct students on how to wash them, to scrub them and to scrub the paint off. Not to say that it wasn't done occasionally, because it certainly was. So this is a group of people having spent the day in the field, and now they are back here washing their pottery and putting it in these big cassettes or plastic trays to dry. So dry, and then the next day they're usually totally dry because it's the Mediterranean. And then I pick it up and take it to the lab. And then, so this, I may have, a dozen trays every day with thousands of pieces of pottery to deal with. So we have to get through it. One of the ways we do is basically dump it out and try to sort it out in a really rough way. What is courseware versus fineware piles, So courseware would include pithoi sherds, right? We talked about pithoi being those big storage containers. So we might put those all in one pile, and then we might put fine, delicate, breakable things in another pile. We might put things that were obviously based on fabric and shape in certain groups. Usually, not much time is spent on the pithoi. It's usually undecorated. It's huge. It's large. It's many. It weighs a lot. So you weigh it and you count it, and then you put it aside and deal with what's left. Ultimately, what's going to tell you the most about cultural activity are the diagnostic pieces. What I mean diagnostic is those that tell a story. Sometimes they tell a story because of their shape. They can be a rim or a handle, or tell me what kind of vessel it's from. Sometimes it tells a story because of its decoration. Sometimes it tells a story because of its unique fabric. So we do a finer sorting by categorizing things by fabric first. You'd be surprised at the diversity of clays utilized to make these things. Partly it's diverse sometimes because they come from completely different areas. Sometimes the diversity is about the choice of the potter. And then once we've sorted all these things out, we record them in such ways, we weigh them, we measure them, we label them, and we bag them, and we photograph them, and so forth. But one of the things we do is we lay them out so we can kind of picture the diagnostic pieces, the things that can tell stories, right? All from one particular context, and say, is it telling me anything? So here's an example. Here's an example of layer 3. This would have been a 6th century layer. And so here are all the diagnostic pieces. And these are all laid out in a very structured way, a universal way of laying out pottery. On the top here, I have rims, various rims. I can see that it's not all one type of rim. Not all one. So I can see that I have a variety of different kinds of vessels. And then in the next layer, we have handles. And again, I see a variety of handles. Again, telling me that I have a variety of different kinds of vessels. Next layer is bases. Some of these bases are much larger, some are much smaller. That one is even decorated. And then finally will be body sherds that are diagnostic, that are decorated. Plain body sherds are not laid out here. They are quantified and qualified and counted and, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't usually tell us very much, to be perfectly honest. We're with a limited number of hours to spend on each sherd, we're much better off focusing on those things that can act as clues or evidence to something else. Here's another one where I've laid out a group of pottery from layer 10. This is much older, much more colorful, wouldn't you say? Much more decorated. Looks much different than that, doesn't it? And I'm going to have something to say about that. So this is from a 7th century context. And these are very different looking things. Again, along the top here, these first 2 rows are rims. But those rims, suggest a variety of different kinds of vessels. These are handles. Yes, this is a handle. It's a big strap handle. And there's another handle protruding out of the body of that little piece. We have some bases here. Just these 3 bases, it looks like. And a variety of diagnostics or painted body sherds here. So in general, these are the categories of ceramics that we excavated from the profile at Monte Polizzo in Sicily. And these are probably similar categories that you would find throughout the island. The truth is, though, that several of these categories are categories that you would find anywhere in the Mediterranean. I just about guarantee you. Depending on the time period, of course. Pithoi are something that you find in Mesopotamia. You find all throughout the Mediterranean, and you also find them through a huge span of time. Certainly going back to the late Neolithic period. Once you start getting big things to store, you need storage containers. So societies that are making pottery, tend to create these things out of clay. So pithoi, transport amphorae, cookware, imports here from Phoenicians and Etruscans, a type of locally made indigenous pottery that is gray, so we call it grayware. Greek colonial productions, Aegean Greek imports. Now the difference between these two is both of these things are Greek, but it helps us to delineate between the two of them because it helps us to answer other questions. Things that are coming from the Aegean Sea, right, from where the Greek homeland is, are made out of clays by Greek, potters in the Greek realm and clays that are from that area. Greek colonial productions tend to look very like the Aegean productions, but they don't seem to have quite the same quality often. And they certainly don't have the same clay. And sometimes that's part of it too. That's part of the quality issue. What appears to be, granted, we're looking at these things, aren't we, from quite a distance in time, aren't we? So the stuff from the Aegean seems to endure and actually look pretty good, but the colonial stuff doesn't look so good after sitting in the ground that long, and it's partly because of the materials that they're made of break down more easily. Anyway, and the final set here is one that we just randomly, well, not randomly, for sake of better terminology, we call indigenous domestic tablewares. And it's a culturally specific set of vessels used by Elimian people traditionally, and for food serving and processing. And this particular category is not gray. So I'm just going to show you some examples of all these categories and tell you a little bit about what we found or why it's of interest. So here's some examples of pithoi. Again, pithos is the singular, pithoi is the plural. I want to point out this picture because it's probably the most frequent sort of vision you would find in the field. Basically, you have layers of broken pithoi. Do you see how thick they are, right, and how coarse they are? I mean, they're huge. Quite honestly, like I said, they're used throughout the Mediterranean. I mean, the Minoan people in the Bronze Age buried people in them. I mean, they're that big, really. Here's a bunch of broken ones that someone's taken the time to put together. But they clearly don't have the entire vessel. This picture is fun too, because do you see this little bit right in between? This is a Greek aribolos. And a aribolos is a small little vessel that's used to hold perfumed oil. And so here we have this delicate little vessel. In fact, it's not the whole thing. This is the top. The oil would have come out of that little middle bit. And there's the rim, and it goes in, and here's the shoulder. That's right, terminology I'm using. The neck is underneath the rim. That's right. We use this terminology when we're talking about pots, right? Neck, rim, body, right? We kind of, treat them as if they're anthropomorphic. Anyway, so the body, much of the body is broken off of the cerebellus. We don't have the base or the body, but it's sort of crammed in between what's left of it. These giant, coarse shards of pithoi. Anyway, sorry, excuse me. So Throughout these slides, I'm going to show you some of my statistics and some of my finds throughout all my field seasons, and what I've discovered that it's funny. Harris Matrix 1, which was just kind of the disturbed modern layer, things that have been churned up, either churned up or brought down the hill and placed on top for rainstorms and that sort of thing. So it would make sense that the most would be on top, and this is not stuff that was found in situ. It's like I said, it's probably coming up from the Acropolis and further up the hill. Harris Matrix number 2, however, this is predominantly the 6th century, right? So we've got a lot of these storage jars in that Harris Matrix. Very few in 3, which I can't really explain. And we also have, them represented in 4 or 5. There's not really too much to say about them. People store food in jars. And when they break, they throw them away. Sometimes they're decorated. That's interesting. We found very, very few decorated ones. They're almost all plain. This is a fancy one that's in a museum. That's not from our site, I confess. And this one isn't from our site either. Mostly we have plain shards that just look very like these. Transport amphorae is another category of finds, and one that's super interesting, because transport amphorae is often an indicator of foreign contact, as I say here. The word amphorae is one that's frequently used when referring to Mediterranean vessels. When you say amphorae, it usually means something that holds a liquid. Just plain old amphorae would be something that holds a liquid that you could put on a table. You would probably not pour from it, maybe store liquids from it. You'd probably pour more from a pitcher. A transport amphorae is different from that in that it holds a liquid and is specifically designed for transportation. I unfortunately didn't give you a picture of that here. I wasn't, thinking, but I'll try to find one and post it. But you can also probably easily enough just Google the terms transport amphorae, and you can even say Greek transport amphorae, or Roman transport, whatever. You'll find that they don't have a flat bottom, so you can't just stand them up on a table or on the ground or anything else. They have a pointed bottom, and the reason they have a pointed bottom is it allows them to fit together well in the hull of a ship. The pointed bits can sort of slide between amphorae underneath it and are held in place by all being packed together. So, interesting thing about transport amphorae too is throughout, broad periods of time in the Mediterranean millennia, people have been transporting things using these, and everybody kind of makes their own. So you might be able to tell the contents of something by the shape of an amphora. A Phoenician amphora would look very different than an Egyptian amphora, a transport amphora. In fact, different Ionic Greek transport amphora might look very different than a Doric Greek transport amphora. They might be somewhat close related because they're serving the same function. Anyway, so we do see a few transport amphorae in the Monte Polizzo context, so here's a couple of examples, and we do know that stuff is coming in then from foreign places. This is a Phoenician one right here. It's really easy to know. You see how all those white flecks, it's all the salt leaching out from the clay that they use in North Africa. Here's tells a little bit about the amphorae that we found here, that the largest number of transport amphorae are coming, perhaps unsurprisingly, from Greek imports. Um, and yeah. Okay, cookware. Cookware is interesting. You never find a whole cook pot because it's super, super crumbly. They're very, very coarse. They're not too hard to break, but they're made in a specific way for a specific reason. They can withstand high heat because there's, sort of spaces and voids, for expansion and contraction. But we found vessels, cookware vessels, as well as what I would call cooking surfaces, flat pieces made out of the exact same material, often with fingerprints in them. Isn't that cool? Right? They're like, but the prints are there for a reason. Perhaps to try, but I think it might, be like surfaces for like perhaps unleavened bread or something. That's just my guess. I have nothing to prove it whatsoever. Perhaps, there are some modern comparisons of Mediterranean cultures making unleavened bread, certainly with bread ovens. So, but I think these areas, were for cooking that sort of thing. So, but they're pretty constant throughout and this is example of the kind of shape that they would have been in. Phoenician imports. Hello, sorry. Phoenician imports. Not that many, I've got to be honest with you, but super cool and interesting. And these are probably coming from that site nearby, right? Mozia or Mozia. And so one of the things that was cool, only found one of them, but a lamp, right? You see the burning here? So it's just a bit of a sort of a lamp that held oil and you burn to light, light your way. Kind of cool. So that was coming from North Africa, Carthaginian lamp. Two Phoenician jugs here. The Phoenicians they always did these stripes, right, at the base, the outer base of their jugs. This one was obvious from the get-go, partly because of this really red clay. It was clear that, again, it's another African product. And this plate, there's this guy, this German guy, bless him. He spent a whole career studying these plates. Yeah. And so he left lots and lots and lots of material in terms of drawing plates and being able to date them. So I'm thankful to him because that gives us a very secure date for that particular context, certainly, by looking at this Phoenician plate, which he calls umbilical bowls. I suppose because they have this sort of center to them. There's even a few shards of Etruscan material. I don't have a whole vessel. I had to take a picture from the nearby Greek site, actually, right? That's that closest Greek site of Selinus, of what an Etruscan cantharos would look like. And so here's a shard from Monte Polizzo that's probably a cantharos. Now, one of the things that's super telling is look at that clay, right? I mean, that just looks like nothing nothing else. It's as black as night. And that's coming from a specific process called bucero that the Etruscans engaged in. So there's not a lot of Etruscan Etruscan imports, but in fact, there's far less than Phoenician. But remember, the Etruscans didn't have a settlement just to the west of Monte Polizzo. So, but they also weren't that far away in that they were in Italy, were they? So stuff that's coming from the Aegean Sea, right? One of those subsidiary seas of the Mediterranean. Here are things all coming from there. Most of the pictures I'm showing you here are Corinthian, except for this one at the bottom right, which is East Greek or Ionian. And they're all decorated in some way. The clay, like I said, is very different than things that are being produced on the island of Sicily. So here's a few statistics that are actually quite interesting. Here I am showing you the kinds of forms or vessel forms that we find of Greek pottery at Monte Polizzo. Some things I can give you no more than saying that it is some kind of open vessel, i.e. something in which you can, like a bowl, in which you can see the inside, or a wide cup that you can see the inside. Cups and bowls are open vessels. Some I can tell you no more other than it is a closed vessel. I know this because of the way the inside is created and the shape of of just the portion of the vessel that I get. A jug would be a closed vessel. I have a couple examples of these little trinket boxes called pyxides, or pyxis, singular. Here's the lid of a pyxis. Right? There's a lid of a Corinthian pyxis there. It would have sat on a box. Going down to the bottom here, I have a ribelloid. Oh, you remember that tiny little sherd tiny little part of a vessel we saw between those pithos sherds, right? That was an ribelloid, or ribellos in the singular, sorry. So evidently those small perfumed oil dispensers were coming in here. Not a lot of them, but some of them were. But jumping back up to the category before, ribelloid, right? Drinking vessels, right? I mean, hello. I mean, is there competition here? No, absolutely not. So that's interesting. Why so many drinking vessels? Also of interest here, down here, I've just separated those things that are Corinthian from those things that are Ionic or East Greek, right? And it seems that very clear that except for, in one, but we already talked about Harris Matrix 1 being a mixed context, stuff coming from the top of the hill, so we can more or less ignore it. Because it's not going to really be accurate information, but on all the other levels, Corinthian is more, and that makes total sense. Because if you recall, when I was talking about that colony of Selinus, right, just to the south there, that Greek colony, it's closest, those were colonists coming from Corinth. That's right. So it would make perfect sense that those people had access to Corinthian things or made Corinthian copies, but also kept ties perhaps with their mother city, where they came from in the motherland, right? So it makes sense that Monte Polizzo would be trading some things with them and some Corinthian things to be coming in via that. So that all makes sense. Now, I'm going to hold off talking more about these drinking vessels for another minute, okay, until we talk about this next slide, Greek colonial productions. Because in a way we can, shove these things together, and in a way it's helpful to separate them. So looking at the Greek colonial statistics, let's just cut to the chase, right? When I look at just colonial forms, what do we got here? Cups, right? That's the number one by far. When I that's the ones that are not painted. And then when I look at the ones that are painted, the fancier ones, what do I got? Cups. Cups. I'm sorry. Cups, 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 cups. Cups are important. Why cups? Here's my 2 cents, and it's not coming completely out of thin air. There's been comparative studies to Greek pottery found in places like France and on other islands, and in Italy for that matter, to suggest that when these places first start to, in fact, in Etruria, even with the Etruscans, sorry to interrupt myself, when these places first began to utilize Greek imports, it's not because they think, oh man, they're so cool looking. I just love those Greeks things. They know how to make a cup better than I do. Oh no. Oh no, 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 no. In fact, one of the things that's interesting is the Olympian side here, they don't have any cups. They don't use cups. Why the hell do they need a cup? They don't need cups. They probably use these things called dippers, right? Instead of cups. Like a common sort of like ladle, right? So you'd come out, take a sip, put it back in. The next person would come out, take it out, right? Imagine the colds that got spread that way. Anyway, so they didn't use cups. Why would they want these stupid Greek cups? I'm going to suggest there's a reason, because with those stupid Greek cups comes a Greek cultural activity and a product. That's right. Can you guess? Can you guess? Cultural activity, cups, and a product that goes with them. What do you think goes in those cups? You guessed right, huh? Oh yeah, I wish I had a glass right now. Wine. That's right. So what these cups I think represent is the introduction of wine, which is probably what's coming from those transport amphorae that we saw earlier. It's wine coming in. And the cups, and how do you drink this wine? Why, they probably visited the Salinas people, and they're like, come friends, let's hang out. I'm going to have one of our wine parties. And the people from, I can just, this is me making things up, but imagine the people from Monte Polizzo coming there and say, okay, right, what's this thing called, would you call it a cup? Huh, that's a bit weird. Oh, no, drink, check it out. Like, well, where's the common ladle? No, drink. And they, one sip of wine, and what do you think, right? It's like, oh yeah, let's have some of this stuff. And it gets even better once they've had about 30 or 40 sips, right? Because they're like, oh, definitely got to have this stuff, right? So we think that that's actually what's happening a lot throughout the Western Mediterranean, is that when local indigenous peoples start to bring in things that aren't theirs, it's not because they, in fact, not because they think that the Greeks are, somehow better than them. It's like, oh, well, we have Greek stuff now. What do we need our stuff for? Because we're clearly inferior to these foreign people. No, that's ridiculous. But, the only reason I'm making fun about stuff like this is because, quite honestly, a lot of 19th century scholars would have asserted that Greeks brought the gift of culture. And when the barbarians first encountered the Greeks, they could clearly see their superiority and wanted to be Greek too. And they said it just like that. But you and I both know that's crazy. And they didn't, though. So part of my work, this post-colonial theory, is to basically say that the European people, white people, don't bring amazingness to places like Africa, nor did, is that same thing happening back here in the ancient Mediterranean world. So it's fascinating that, how sensible indigenous people are, right? Absolutely sensible. But, in this case, I concur. Wine is good, and bring the cups that come with it. That sounds just fine to me. Anyway, jugs are also important, and I'm guessing that through these jugs, we also see, you see jugs here and jugs here. With the jugs, you get the vessel for pouring that wine. So let's, my next two slides, I want to just look at some of the vessels that the indigenous people are creating themselves. And there's that gray where I talked about it. Why? Because it's gray. And there it is, being gray. Yay, gray. We can see that it's often decorated. They often have the sort of a dente de lupe design, which the wolf's teeth design is a common design. And sometimes they incise all kinds of decorations within the wolf's teeth. Parallel lines are common too. So they have a relatively limited repertoire of designs that they're doing on their pottery. The Excuse me. So what is my little statistical graph showing here? Well, when you're going through a massive amount of data, i.e., tens of thousands of sherds, it's always important to separate things when you can. Because once you've gone through it all, you can't go back and separate it without doing all your work all over again. What you can do, however, is when you're done, is you can merge things together or separate them if you need to. And I think that my little chart here for decorated and undecorated gray wares is one of the examples where perhaps they should have been merged together. What this is showing here is that I have a much larger percentage of undecorated gray ware than I do decorated gray ware. And that's because so when I got a piece, like, for example, look at this one that's been glued here, Harris Matrix 2, that's been glued onto the larger piece. If I got that piece, it went into my decorated gray wares category. But what would have happened if I got one of these lower pieces? That would have gone into my undecorated category. And quite honestly, I think what you can see, if we look at all these vessels in the photographs here, you'll see, even look at this Harris Matrix 3 examples, right? It's decorated just close to the rim, but the whole bottom part, i.e. the largest portion of the vessel, is not decorated. And when I get a sherd from just there, right, I have no idea whether the rest of the vessel is decorated in any way or not. So, that being said, I would suggest that especially since they're more or less on the same trajectory here, that these two different categories can easily be combined. And what we see in that combination, especially if we're looking at Harris Matrix 2 through 5, is the relative consistency, quite honestly, which is probably something to be expected, right? Is that indigenous people would, this is the staple, pottery. This is the everyday stuff. This is normal, right? And that normal, i.e. culturally significantly normal, would stay that way over time. And so, yeah, I say this is a Limian. Now, I have another category. Yeah, I'm not saying that this is my favorite slide, granted. Take a while to get yourself situated because I think that I've not made this terribly clear. And I'll sort of walk you through some of it. But this is also another form of indigenous made pottery that is not consistent, right? It's not the norm. It's not the basic. It's not the staple. It's not something that says we are Limian and we use these vessels. This is something that is made locally. Don't get me wrong. How dare I say it's not a Limian if it's made locally? But the trends are different, and they're different for a reason. This particular category of pottery is very telling. Let's see. So first of all, I don't even know where should we start looking. Let's just look at the pieces first, and then we'll look at at my statistics. So when I'm talking about domestic tableware, I'm actually talking about things that go on the table. Yeah, really, honestly, that you would use as service. As service, this is a jug for pouring. Pouring what? Probably, I don't know, water. This is an amphorae for storing liquids. Remember I talked about amphorae before? There was the kind for storing, then there was the kind for transport. This is the kind for storing. There's actually various different kinds of forms an amphora takes. I just don't want to confuse you now. This particular vessel is not from Monte Polizzo, because quite honestly, at Monte Polizzo, we mostly got chunks like this. Just portions. But you can see how this is a very similar type vessel as this. So that's amphorae. And Polizzello is actually a site that's not very far away from Monte Polizzo. Oinakawe. That is a Greek term, and quite honestly, it may well be the Greeks that introduced that particular form. It's handy, super handy. Look at the top of it. It's a 3-spouted or trefoil rim. So I can pour from forward or left or right, to be perfectly honest. However I need to, I can pour. And we have actually quite a lot of those at Monte Polizzo. So clearly, this is a form that is being adopted. Up here, this is interesting. These are very indigenous forms. These are those dippers. Remember, I was talking about the proverbial ladle in a bucket for drinking water, and in a shared, like, kind of consider it the Olympian, water fountain. Next, step up, get your dipper out, dip it in. That's what I think this is used for drinking. I should publish something on that, but anyway. As I should the cups. I should need to publish that too. I need time, for God's sakes. Anyway, here is a bowl, right? It's a very indigenous bowl and so forth. All right, so I've given you a tour. I've got a bowl, I've got a dipper, I've got an unakaway, I've got a table amphora. These are all common forms, and they're treated in the same way, so they are not gray, right? Each one of these is painted. And moreover, it's a different kind of fabric. A different clay is being used to create these vessels than is used to create the grayware. And that's interesting too. Why? My answer to that is one in which I'm using material culture from the site to try and interpret political, socio-political dynamics. And I will get into that in more detail in a moment. But the first thing I want you to look at here, again, I shouldn't even put number 1 on here because it distracts us and number 1 is useless. But if we look 2, 3, 4, 5 Harris matrices, we see that there's a trend, do we not? Remember that 5 is our oldest layer. So in Harris matrix number 5, we used quite a bit of this decorated tableware. We used slightly less in 4 and a noticeably less amount in 3 and extremely declined amount in 2 to almost, well, we're ignoring 1, right? So we noticed that, right? This is what I think is going on. In the 7th century, that Harris Matrix 5, those older layers, right? That indigenous matte painted wares, well, they dominate, right? They are popular. They're incredibly popular. While the gray wares continue from even older traditions. We know that those gray wares go back centuries before we even see them at Monte Polizzo and are very common in the region. And we know at that same time that that's happening, that imports coming from outside are less than 5% of the assemblage. Now, in the 6th century, things changed. Those matte painted wares, those ones that I just showed you with all those designs, that table amphora and the dipper and all, the way that particular style of doing pottery all but disappears. And they start, offering only sort of undecorated versions. And strangely enough, about the same time, I guess something's got to replace it. Their traditional, right, grayware, this is us, this is base, that tends to go up. And at the same time, the imports go down. And colonial productions increase by about 6%. All right. So what's happening here? Perhaps these graphs will help. What I think is happening requires also that I give you one more piece of information. Do you remember going back there in the slide and looking the slide where I said, this is what's happening at Monte Polizzo in the 8th century, and this is what's happening in the Western Mediterranean. This is what's happening in Monte Polizzo in the 7th century, and this is what's happening in the rest of Western Mediterranean, etc., etc. What is happening in the early period, i.e., 8th century, when the Greeks in particular and Phoenicians, but the Greeks in particular, are just traveling around the Western Mediterranean long before they're setting up any colonies or whatever. They're just trading with people. They're like, hey, how's it going? I'm a Greek guy, and I see you're an Elymian, and I've got some good stuff. Perhaps you've got some good stuff. Hey, I tell you what. You just give me that stuff that you don't have value, which, I think is fantastic, and you can have this cool stuff that I don't value and you think is fantastic, and we both feel like we're winners, and this is great. I'm just guessing. I don't know. And some of the stuff that's being given in trade to the Elymians from the Greeks is what we call geometric pottery. Just pottery. Nothing that's particularly valuable coming from the Greeks. They're just some clay pots. Nothing that the Greeks would have considered, particularly important or of artistic greatness or, like I said, anything of any potential value. Just some old pots. But they happen to be decorated in a very geometric way. A way, quite honestly, that resembles, astoundingly, the way we see the Elymian pottery being decorated here, right, in the 7th century. So I would suggest what's being happened here. When this stuff appears, it appears like a fad almost, like, whoa, cool, right? 5th century, let's just start cranking this stuff out. It looks a lot like that stuff that Greek trader guy looks a lot. Honestly, a lot of these patterns, this one really looks very Greek geometric. But it is clearly Sicilian. So a lot of those patterns are, I think, reflective of good relations. It's like, hey, those Greek guys, they stop by now and again. It's kind of cool. They bring stuff, and in fact, they don't bring enough. So we're going to start making some of our own because we can. And so I think it's reflective of good relations. But that's like the 8th century, right? So certainly by the 7th, everything is fine. But then the Greeks start moving in, which perhaps it does not set off alarm bells in the beginning. They're moving, and Greeks are moving in distant places, and they're just right by the seashore. The Illyrians are living inland, where there's good farmland and stuff, right? So they're not necessarily a maritime people, right? They're an agrarian society. So they're not really fussed about those Greeks living on the littoral regions. But I think as those colonies grow, especially into the 6th century, and they start setting up sub-colonies all their own, and they start growing in population, they start to expand into the hinterland. They start to butt up against important resources and territories of the indigenous people. And I think that this does two things. Number one, it impoverishes the indigenous people, and it also triggers a negative reaction that we can see in the material record. I think the indigenous peoples are saying, screw you, we don't want you anymore or anything that looks like you. So we see that abrupt halt in things that look Greek-like. I don't know. There's my 2 cents. You take it as you please. You will not be tested on it. Anyway, I bet you're tired of hearing me talk. I think I'm getting tired. I need a cup of tea. So I'm going to let you look at that next slide yourself, I just want to tell you that, the work I've done at Monte Polizzo is really, I am proudly say that it has been incredibly important. It has now allowed other scholars to interpret their information. Sites that could not be dated can now be dated based on the sequence that I produced. Great things have happened with respect to studying the faunal analyses, and as well as the botanical records that extracted from Monte Polizzo. And so the following slide gives you just a little list of the kind of um, of seeds and so forth that have been found through the flotation archaeobotanical studies at Monte Polizzo by the Germans. And certainly affirms the fact that these people were agriculturalists. They were cultivators. And so anyway, I hope you enjoyed our first presentation for our online class. There will be others. I suspect they won't be quite as long as this one. I can't really help myself. Forgive me. One more thing I want to say is that if there's anyone of you that requires closed captioning, I've hopefully ticked all the right boxes on YouTube to allow that. But I'm told that it comes up with some pretty crazy interpretations of what I'm saying. And if this is not serving you sufficiently and allowing you to learn this material, then you should contact me, and I will certainly connect with the Disabilities Resource Center and see if we can't better serve you. So thank you for enrolling in Mediterranean Archaeology. I cannot wait to continue on in our semester. Feel free to email me. Because I am, in a way, because I'm not meeting you, I feel all the more obliged to make sure that I respond quickly to your questions and requests. As I say in the syllabus, I think your question reflects one that might be shared by other students, I'll often respond to that through Canvas in such a way that we can all see it by announcement. And there was something else I was going to say. Oh, and that I'm going to try this whole sort of virtual office hour thing and see if that works. I don't know. So in other words, I've said on my syllabus that I'll do chat times from 11 to 12, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I'm going to just see how that goes. I personally find a fixed time does not work so well for people, for you or for me. And that perhaps a better thing would be for me to be more flexible and allow you to just, contact me when it suits you and respond to you as soon as I can. Again, making it a priority because of the fact that it's an online class. Anyway, I can go on, but I'm sure you're done hearing me drone on. And you'll be hearing from me again very soon. Bye.